Imagine this. You're sitting in your living room, just another ordinary day, when suddenly the phone rings. It's one of those moments when you feel like something's about to change, but you don't know what. On the other end of the line is a desperate mother. She can barely speak, her voice trembling, almost out of breath. Her son, Robbie, has simply vanished. She told me he was a promising young man, full of life and energy, a talented boxer who was just starting to gain recognition. But then, poof, gone. At first I thought, maybe he just left, took a few days to clear his head. It's something that happens, especially with young people under pressure. But something in her voice, that hesitation, that deep fear, told me it was more than that. It's been days since he came back, she said. Robbie doesn't just disappear like this. And there I was, in the middle of this mystery. She and her husband had tried everything. Searching the town, calling friends, even visiting the boxing gym. Nothing. Robbie had vanished without a trace. So, I began my journey to figure out what happened to Robbie. There was this feeling that something bigger was hiding just behind the curtain, waiting to be revealed. Little did I know at the time, this search would lead me down dark and dangerous paths, where some questions should never be asked, and some answers are more frightening than any nightmare. In the middle of the investigation, something started to bother me. During conversations with friends and family, one name came up more than once: Tony. He wasn't mentioned often, but whenever his name surfaced, people would get strangely quiet, look away, like they were afraid to say more about him. I started asking about this Tony, but it seemed no one wanted to dive into the subject. The more I asked, the more uncomfortable people got. It was as if I was touching on something that was better left alone. Then, Robbie's mom, hesitant, told me about a phone call Robbie had received days before he disappeared. She didn't know the details, but she remembered that he seemed tense after answering the phone. And guess who was on the other end? That's right, Tony. Suddenly, all the clues seemed to point to him, but with no direct explanation. A guy no one wanted to talk about, a mysterious phone call right before the disappearance. Somehow, Tony was at the center of it all, and I had to figure out why. Every time I tried to dig deeper, I felt like I was getting closer to something dangerous. But it was too late to turn back. I knew I had to find this Tony, so I did what any detective would do. I started snooping around the places he was known to hang out. Everything led to a pub tucked away in the darker part of town. The kind of place where people know the less you ask, the safer you are. I walked in, blended in with the tired faces, pretending to be just another customer. After a few rounds of back and forth, I started to hear murmurs. Names, faces, muffled conversations. And there he was, Tony, sitting in the corner with a group around him, like he was the center of that little shady universe. I watched him from afar, careful not to draw attention. He was bigger than I imagined, with a presence that said he was used to being feared. As the night went on, one of the guys in the group got up and headed to the bathroom. I seized the opportunity and moved closer, playing it cool, ordering another beer at the bar. Tony glanced in my direction but didn't give me much notice. It was now or never. I struck up a conversation with the bartender, trying to pry something out of him, but the response was cold. This wasn't going to be easy. Still, it was enough to confirm one thing. That pub was more than just a hangout. It was a base of operations. And Tony, well, he wasn't just another mysterious name in Robbie's disappearance. He was directly involved. The problem? I was getting too close. Close enough for them to notice I wasn't just some curious onlooker. As I kept watching, the conversations started to heat up. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. They knew about fights. Not the regular, sanctioned ones like Robbie was used to. These were illegal fights. No rules, no protection, just brutal violence. Tony, apparently, was the organizer of these fights. He controlled everything from who fought to the bets placed. And then it all made sense. Robbie, the promising young boxer, he had gotten mixed up in it. Maybe it was the pressure, maybe it was easy money. But whatever the reason, he had entered Tony's circle. I found out that Robbie had last been seen leaving one of these underground events. No one knew if he had won or lost, but one thing was certain. He never made it home. A dark feeling crept over me as I processed this information. Robbie wasn't just missing. He had been pulled into something much bigger, much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Tony and his gang were neck-deep in this. I knew I was on the right track, but now the challenge was different. Finding out what really happened to Robbie that night. Because if he had lost that fight, or if he had crossed the wrong people, the end of the story could be much darker than anyone was prepared to face. I was getting in too deep, and I knew it. But with each new clue, the picture became clearer and darker. Then came the warning. One day, as I was walking back to my car after another night investigating that pub, I found something strange. A folded piece of paper on my windshield. I looked around, but the street was deserted. I grabbed the paper and, with trembling hands, unfolded it. The message was short, direct, and sent chills down my spine. If you want to stay alive, stop now. Your family won't like a visit from us. I knew what this meant. Tony knew I was on his tail, and he wasn't going to let it slide. They didn't just threaten me, but my family too. For a moment, I thought about dropping everything. The adrenaline mixed with fear was telling me to back off. The instinct to protect those I loved was strong. But then Robbie's face came to mind. I had promised his mother I'd find out what happened. I couldn't stop now. Still, I knew I was dealing with dangerous people. People who would do anything to protect their secrets. And at this point, the darkest secret was Robbie's fate. The warning was clear. I had to make a choice. Continue and risk everything, or walk away and live with the doubt and the guilt that maybe Robbie had been killed for getting involved in these illegal fights. But one thing was certain. From that moment on, I wasn't just investigating anymore. I was a target. We got the case on an ordinary morning. It was a middle-aged man, one of those types you can tell carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. He walked into my office with a wary look, like he was about to reveal something that had been tormenting him for a long time. "My wife is playing me," he said bluntly. There was no uncertainty in his voice, only frustration and a certain desperation. He believed his wife, a much younger woman, was involved with a coworker. It was a situation I'd seen before. Marriages unbalanced by age differences, suspicions growing like weeds in the cracks of the routine. But this client wasn't just here because of jealousy. He had a gut feeling, a dark intuition that bothered him more than the evidence he couldn't find. He handed me photos, messages, even snippets of conversations he'd overheard casually. But none of it was conclusive. He knew something was wrong, but his wife always seemed to be one step ahead, like she knew exactly what he was trying to uncover. It was driving him crazy. "She's cheating on me, and I'm going to find out how," he said, with a determination I only saw in clients who were about to dive into very dark waters. And so, I found myself at the center of another infidelity investigation. But something about this case told me things wouldn't be as simple or obvious. Sometimes what's hidden in the shadow of a marriage can be far scarier than any truth uncovered. As the weeks passed, I started following the wife's steps, observing her routines. She was smart, very smart. Every time I thought I was about to catch something concrete, she changed course. Felt like she knew she was being watched. Every suspicious meeting the husband thought would be a revelation ended up being a normal work outing. A trip to the store, nothing unusual. It was frustrating. He texted me every day, asking for updates, and I always had the same answer, "Nothing yet." But that wasn't enough for him, and I could see that the uncertainty was slowly eating him alive. I started using different methods, but every time I got close to something, she slipped away. No suspicious messages, no odd behavior. It was like she was always one step ahead of both of us, making me wonder if there really was something wrong or if the husband's paranoia was leading me down a dead end. I tried to get ahead of her, changing my own surveillance schedules, using different angles, but nothing. Everything she did seemed meticulously planned to look normal. And every time I thought I might be onto something, she made an unexpected turn, leaving me in the dark once again. If something was happening, this woman was good at hiding it. But I knew no one can keep up a facade forever. The question that haunted me was, how much longer could she stay ahead of me and her husband? I was starting to lose my patience. I knew something was going on, but she kept slipping away. Then the husband decided it was time to take the next step. He called me one night, his voice tense. "I'm going on a business trip tomorrow. I want you to follow her at night. Something tells me that's when they meet." It was a risky move. With him out of the picture, her defenses might lower. As soon as he left town, I got ready. The night was dark, and the streets were quiet when I left the house, like any other night. But this time, something was different. She didn't go to work. She took a completely new route, and I followed. She drove into a more isolated neighborhood, one of those where the houses are spaced out and the streetlights always seem to be in the wrong places, leaving everything in the dark. The anxiety in my chest started to rise. I parked at a safe distance and waited. It didn't take long for an unfamiliar car to pull up a few meters ahead. A man got out of the vehicle and slipped into her car without even looking back. The adrenaline kicked in. This was it. I was finally about to catch them together. I took photos of everything, documenting every move, every interaction. They drove together to a small, discreet apartment in the city center, a place where they could meet without raising suspicion. I stayed there, in the shadows, watching, waiting, knowing that we finally had the proof the husband had been looking for. Now it was just a matter of seeing how far this would go. For a few nights, the same pattern followed. They met in the same place, always after the husband left town. It was almost methodical, like they had rehearsed this routine for months. I kept gathering evidence, documenting everything for the husband. But then, something unexpected happened. One night, while following them as usual, I noticed the routine had changed. This time, she left alone. She drove to the same apartment, but the man didn't show up. I stayed in the car, waiting, certain he would arrive any moment. But strangely, he never came. She went into the apartment alone, and the night passed in an eerie silence. I stayed there, suspicious, until finally, a little before dawn, I decided to check out what was going on. I quietly made my way up the stairs to the apartment. Something was off, I could feel it. The change in routine, the emptiness of the night. There was something deeper. I waited for a while, watching through a small crack in the door. And then, there he was. The lover appeared, but something was wrong. He was alone, with a disturbed look on his face. He went into the apartment, but something about his movements was tense, strange. I got closer, trying to hear what was going on. That's when I realized there was more at play than just a simple affair. Something dark was unfolding behind that door, something I wasn't prepared to discover. I couldn't ignore the growing feeling that something was about to happen. So, I gathered my courage and moved even closer to the door. That's when I heard a muffled sound, something that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't voices arguing or footsteps. It was silence, a heavy silence, broken only by a faint noise of something being dragged. My heart raced. Without thinking twice, I forced the door open, expecting the worst. And there it was. The scene in front of me was a nightmare. The wife, the same woman I had been following, was lying on the floor, lifeless, strangled. The lover, the man I had followed night after night, stood by her body, still holding the sheet he had used to take her life. He didn't try to run. He just looked at me with a hollow emptiness in his eyes. It was as if everything had come crashing down in an instant. The whole case, which seemed like a simple affair, had turned into something much more macabre. And the husband? He had no idea what was waiting for him. The wife he had suspected of cheating was now dead. As I called the police, my mind spun. Should I have seen this coming? Maybe. But nothing prepares you for the moment when a simple infidelity investigation turns into a tragedy. In the end, that man, the lover, had been hiding much more than a forbidden relationship. He was a killer. I got the call from a terrified woman. Her voice trembled in a way that put me on high alert from the first moment. She wasn't calling to say her husband was just working late. It was worse. She explained that he had been staying late at work, or at least that's what he claimed. The excuses were always the same. Endless meetings, too much work piled up. But in the last few weeks, something in his behavior had changed. He was distant, evasive, like he was hiding something. I don't know what he's doing, but I'm sure it's not work, she told me. Her tone was darker than any client I'd ever had. It was as if fear was eating away at her from the inside. So I decided to follow him. On the first night, he left the house at the usual time, but he didn't head to the office. In fact, he didn't go anywhere near his workplace. Instead, I followed him through increasingly dark and deserted streets. He drove for almost an hour until he reached an abandoned industrial area. What the hell was he doing there? I parked at a distance and watched as he got out of the car and entered an old industrial complex. It was the kind of place no one should be visiting, especially not in the middle of the night. What was going on here? I waited a few minutes, observing from afar, trying to figure out what was happening. The place was dark, filthy, and looked completely abandoned. But something was off. It wasn't just the fact that he had gone to that industrial complex without explanation. It was the way he entered, like he knew exactly where he was going. He didn't hesitate for a second. I knew I had to get closer. Moving quietly, I stuck to the shadows, trying not to make a sound. As I got closer, I noticed something disturbing. Faint lights flickering inside one of the warehouses. That didn't make sense. Who would keep lights on in a place like this? And the strangest thing? The noise. Something distant and metallic, like heavy objects being moved. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of illegal operation, smuggling, or worse, but what was her husband doing in the middle of all this? My curiosity began to turn into a growing unease. I knew I had to find out what was happening there, but as I got closer to the building, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if I was about to cross an invisible line, a point of no return. I couldn't back down now. My gut told me that what was at stake here was more than just a simple affair or a change in routine. So, I did something I wouldn't normally do. I decided to infiltrate the building. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had forgotten to close it, or worse, as if they didn't want anyone to notice it was open. I slipped in without making a sound, my footsteps lightly echoing on the concrete floor. The interior was even darker than I'd imagined. The faint lights I saw from outside came from old hanging lamps, swaying on exposed wires, flickering as if they were about to go out at any moment. But what really grabbed my attention was the sound. It was a mix of muffled groans and the clinking of chains being dragged. My heart started to race. I followed the sound to the back of the warehouse. My entire body was on high alert, every muscle tense. And then, I saw something I'll never forget. A man, tied to a chair, with cuts and bruises all over his body, like he'd been tortured. The smell of blood and metal was suffocating. He was in terrible shape, his head slumped to the side, barely breathing. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. And then, my worst fear was confirmed. The woman's husband was there, standing, watching the whole thing, as if he were a spectator at some macabre show. He wasn't just a stressed-out employee working late. No, he had gotten involved in something far, far worse. The shock paralyzed me for a few seconds. The woman's husband was standing there, coldly watching the scene. He didn't look disturbed, didn't seem to have any doubts about what was happening. The man tied to the chair kept moaning softly, too weak to resist. I hid behind a stack of crates, trying to figure out what to do next. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely think straight. What had I just stumbled into? And more importantly, how was I going to get out of there without being seen? But then, something even more disturbing happened. Other men appeared. They were carrying more equipment, and one of them was pushing a cart that looked like it held torture instruments. The scene was surreal. It was like I had walked into a nightmare, something straight out of a horror movie. And the worst part? The husband wasn't just a bystander. He was the one in charge of it all. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave the man tied up behind. He was clearly on the brink of death. And at this point, it wasn't just about witnessing something horrible. I knew that if they found me, I could end up in that chair too. My mind was racing. I needed a plan, and fast. This wasn't just a simple kidnapping. It was a cruel spectacle organized and run by people who did this regularly. And the husband? He wasn't just a side player, he was a central part of this twisted show. I knew I didn't have much time. The place was getting busier, and soon someone would notice me. I couldn't just flee and leave the man tied up, but I also knew that if I acted without thinking, I'd be next in that chair. I took a deep breath and started to plan. At the back of the warehouse, I spotted a metal door. It probably led to a side exit, a path I could use to escape. But before that, I needed to create a distraction. Something that would pull the men's attention away, even for just a few seconds. I looked around and saw some tools on a shelf. I grabbed a heavy wrench and, with all the care I could muster, threw it at a generator in the corner of the warehouse. The noise was deafening. Instantly, the men stopped what they were doing and turned toward the sound. It was the opening I needed. I rushed to the tied-up man. He was weak but still conscious. I quickly started untying the ropes, while he groaned in pain. Every second felt like an eternity. I could hear the men talking, trying to figure out what had caused the noise, but it wouldn't be long before they turned their attention back to us. Finally, I managed to free him. He could barely stand, so I propped him up on my shoulder and led him to the metal door. I shoved it open with all my strength, and the cold night air hit us. We were out. As we ran along the side of the building, the man mumbled something about the woman's husband, something about a debt he should never have gotten involved in. But I could barely make out the words. The only thing that mattered in that moment was getting out alive. I managed to get him into my car, and we sped off before anyone realized we were gone. I knew that night wasn't the end of it. The husband had gotten himself tangled up in something much bigger, something that didn't just involve his double life, but a circle of violence and death the likes of which I had never seen.